The sun was starting to set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. 16-year-old Tiana Johnson walked through Central Park, her debate team pin shining on her backpack. The autumn leaves crunched under her feet as she took the familiar path she'd walked 100 times before. Tiana checked her watch, 5:45 p.m. She had promised to be home by 6:30 for dinner. Her dad was cooking his famous lasagna tonight, and she didn't want to miss it. As the daughter of Police Chief Raymond Johnson, Tiana had been raised with both love and structure. Always be aware of your surroundings, her father would say. Know your rights, but also be respectful. The debate practice had run longer than usual. They were preparing for the state championship, and Tiana was the first speaker. Her folder was stuffed with notes and research. The weight of her backpack pressed against her shoulders, filled with textbooks and her laptop. She decided to rest for a moment. Finding an empty bench near the fountain, Tiana sat down and pulled out her water bottle. She took a long drink, watching as other parkgoers enjoyed the early evening. An older couple walked hand in hand. A man in a business suit hurried along the path, talking loudly on his phone. A few benches away, 3 teenagers were listening to music, laughing and showing each other something on their phones. Tiana pulled out her own phone to text her dad. On my way home. Stopping for a quick rest in the park. She pressed send and smiled at the immediate reply. "Och, sweetheart. Be safe." Her dad always responded right away, no matter how busy he was with police business. She scrolled through her social media for a few minutes, then noticed the park lamps flickering on. Time to get moving. As she was about to stand up, a police car slowly pulled up to the curb nearby. Tiana didn't think much of it. Police cars were as familiar to her as her own living room. 2 officers stepped out. The taller one, Officer Wilson according to his nameplate, walked over to the group of teens. Tiana could hear him asking them to turn down their music. The teens complied, though one of them seemed to be arguing a bit. The second officer, a stocky man with a buzz cut, scanned the area and then fixed his gaze on Tiana. Something in his look made her stomach tighten. She'd seen that look before, not directed at her, but she'd heard her father talk about officers who approached situations already looking for trouble. Tiana straightened her posture and gathered her things, planning to continue her walk home. But the officer was already making his way toward her. "What are you doing out here so late?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Just heading home from school, sir," Tiana replied politely, the way her father had taught her. Debate practice ran late. The officer, his nameplate read Donovan, looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her expensive backpack. "That's a nice bag for a student," he commented. "What's in it?" "Just my school things," Tiana explained, maintaining eye contact. "Books, my laptop, debate notes." Officer Donovan's radio crackled, but he ignored it. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, but his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Tiana felt her heart beat faster. She knew her rights. Her father had made sure of that. "I'm sorry, but do you have a reason to search my bag?" she asked calmly. The officer's expression hardened. "We've had reports of drugs being sold in this area," he said, just being thorough. Tiana looked around. The park was still filled with people walking, jogging, chatting. Nothing seemed suspicious. She took a deep breath. "I understand, officer, but I'm just resting on my way home from school." As she reached for her student ID to prove her story, Officer Donovan suddenly grabbed her backpack from the bench beside her. "Hey," Tiana protested, her composure slipping for the first time. "I'll need to check this," he said firmly. "Park's not a place for teenagers to be hanging around after dark." The sun hadn't even fully set yet. Tiana felt a mix of confusion and anger rising in her chest. This wasn't right, and she knew it. She also knew that her father, the chief of police, would be furious, not at her, but at what was happening. Little did Officer Donovan know who exactly he was dealing with. Tiana reached for her backpack, but Officer Donovan pulled it away. "I told you, I need to check this," he said, his voice harder now. The friendly park around them seemed to fade away as the moment grew tense. "Officer, I know my rights," Tiana said, trying to keep her voice steady like her dad had taught her. "You need probable cause to search my things." Officer Donovan's eyebrows shot up. The other teens had gone quiet now, watching what was happening. Even Officer Wilson glanced over, pausing his conversation. "Oh, we got a junior lawyer here," Officer Donovan said with a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me explain something to you. It's getting dark. You're a teenager alone in the park. That's suspicious behavior." Tiana looked around at the dozens of other people still enjoying the early evening in the park. Families with strollers, people walking dogs, joggers with headphones. None of them were being stopped. "There's nothing suspicious about sitting on a bench," she replied. Her dad's voice echoed in her head. "Always stay calm, but never let anyone walk over your rights. I'm just resting on my way home from school." Officer Donovan unzipped her backpack, ignoring her protest. "We'll see about that." A few people slowed their walks, watching what was happening. An older woman with gray hair frowned deeply. A man in running clothes had stopped completely, his hand hovering near his phone. "My laptop and school books are in there," Tiana said, feeling her cheeks grow hot with frustration. "Please be careful with them." The officer dumped the contents onto the bench, her carefully organized debate notes scattered in the breeze. Her water bottle rolled onto the ground. Her laptop, thankfully in its protective case, landed with a thud. "What's this?" Officer Donovan held up her debate team folder with the school logo. "Like I told you, I'm coming from debate practice. That has all my research for the state competition." He flipped through it, then tossed it down. Next, he picked up her phone that had fallen out. "Give that back, please," Tiana said, reaching for it. "I need to call my dad." "Your dad can wait," Officer Donovan said, pocketing her phone. "What's your name?" "Tiana Johnson," she answered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't scared, she was angry. But she remembered her father's warnings about how showing anger could make things worse. Officer Wilson had finally walked over, looking confused. "Everything okay here, Donovan?" "Just checking this young lady's story," Officer Donovan replied, still rifling through Tiana's things. "Says she's coming from school, but couldn't tell me why she's hanging around the park." "I did tell you," Tiana corrected him firmly. "I was resting for a few minutes on my way home. My debate practice ran late." Officer Wilson looked at the school materials spread across the bench and frowned slightly. Tiana tried again. "Can I please have my phone to call my father? He's expecting me home." "You can call from the station," Officer Donovan said, starting to put her things back into the backpack haphazardly. "The station?" Tiana's eyes widened. "Why would I need to go to the station? I haven't done anything wrong." By now, the three teens from before had their phones out, recording everything. A small crowd had gathered, watching from a respectful distance. "We need to verify your story," Officer Donovan insisted. "You're being uncooperative." "I've answered all your questions," Tiana replied, feeling her voice shake slightly despite her best efforts. "I've done nothing wrong or suspicious. I was sitting on a public bench." Officer Wilson leaned closer to his partner. "Maybe we should." "I'm handling this," Officer Donovan cut him off. He turned back to Tiana. "Stand up. You're coming with us to sort this out." "Am I under arrest?" Tiana asked directly, knowing the answer should be no. "You're being detained for questioning," he replied. The crowd murmured. Someone called out, "She's just a kid." Tiana stood up straight, looking the officer in the eye. "I want to call my father now. He's waiting for me at home." "And who's your father?" Officer Donovan asked with a small smirk, clearly not expecting anything important. Tiana took a deep breath. She didn't usually tell people who her dad was. She didn't want special treatment. But this had gone too far. "My father is Police Chief Raymond Johnson," she said clearly. "And I think he'd be very interested in why you're detaining me without cause." For just a second, Officer Donovan's face froze. But then he shook his head. "Nice try, kid. Let's go." Officer Donovan gripped Tiana's backpack in one hand and gestured toward the police car with the other. The evening had turned cool, and a chill ran through Tiana that had nothing to do with the temperature. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their whispers creating a wave of unease around the scene. "Let's go," Officer Donovan repeated, more firmly this time. Tiana stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere until I can call my father." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Years of listening to her dad's stories about proper police procedure gave her confidence, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. A middle-aged woman stepped forward from the crowd. "Officers, surely this isn't necessary. She's clearly a student. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Donovan, maybe we should. I said I'm handling this. Donovan snapped, his face flushing red. He turned back to Tiana. Look, you can either come willingly or things can get more difficult. The teens who had been recording everything moved closer. One of them, a girl with braided hair, called out, "We got all this on video. You can't just take her." Tiana noticed more phones pointing their way. At least a dozen people were recording now. Part of her felt relieved. Video didn't lie. Another part felt a deep sadness that this was happening at all. "Officer," Tiana tried again, "you've searched my bag and found nothing but school supplies. You've seen my student ID. There's no reason to take me to the station." Officer Donovan stepped closer. "When an officer gives you an order, it needs to be a lawful order," Tiana finished for him. "My father made sure I understand that." Something flickered in Officer Wilson's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. He studied Tiana's face more carefully. "What did you say your last name was?" "Johnson," she replied. "Tiana Johnson." Officer Wilson's expression changed stubbornly. "And your father is?" "Chief Raymond Johnson," Tiana said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Someone whispered, "The police chief's daughter." Officer Wilson's face paled. He touched his partner's arm. "Donovan, we need to talk. Now." But Officer Donovan shook his head. "She's lying. It's an obvious trick." He grabbed Tiana's arm. "Let's go." Tiana yanked her arm back. "Don't touch me. I have the right to make a phone call." At the station, Donovan insisted, reaching for her again. A businessman in the crowd shouted, "Hey, leave her alone. She's just a kid." The situation was spinning out of control. More people were gathering, voices rising in protest. Officer Wilson looked increasingly distressed, his eyes darting between his partner, Tiana, and the growing crowd. "Wilson, call for backup," Donovan ordered, his hand moving to rest on his belt. That was when Officer Wilson made a decision. He pulled out his own phone and handed it to Tiana. "Call your father. Right now." Officer Donovan's face contorted with anger. "What are you doing?" "Preventing a mistake," Wilson replied grimly. Tiana's fingers shook as she dialed her father's number. After 2 rings, he picked up. "This is Chief Johnson," her father's familiar voice said. "Dad," Tiana said, her voice finally breaking. "I need your help." There was a brief silence. When her father spoke again, his voice was deadly calm. "Where are you, Tiana?" "Central Park, near the east entrance fountain. 2 officers have detained me. One of them took my backpack and phone. They want to take me to the station." "Put the officer on," her father said. Officer Wilson had already stepped away from his partner. "Sir, this is Officer Wilson, badge number 4872. The crowd watched in tense silence. Tiana couldn't hear what her father was saying, but Officer Wilson's face grew increasingly ashen. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Right away, sir." He handed the phone back to Tiana. "Honey, are you hurt?" her father asked immediately. "No, Dad. I'm okay. Just upset. Stay right there. I'm 3 minutes away." Officer Donovan was staring at his partner. "What's going on?" "We made a mistake," Wilson said, his voice hollow, a big one. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing the shift in power. Officer Wilson approached Tiana and handed her backpack to her with careful respect. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, Miss Johnson," he said formally. "Your father is on his way." Officer Donovan stood frozen, the full reality of the situation finally dawning on his face. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder with each passing second. The wail of police sirens filled the air as 3 patrol cars pulled up to the park entrance, lights flashing across the gathering crowd. Officer Donovan's face had drained of all color. He stood stiffly, eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles, as if hoping the ground might open up and swallow him. "What have you done?" he whispered to his partner. Officer Wilson didn't answer. His attention was on the lead car, where a tall man in a police chief's uniform was already stepping out before the vehicle had fully stopped. The crowd parted like water as Chief Raymond Johnson strode through. His face was a mask of controlled emotion, his steps measured and deliberate. Several officers followed him, but kept a respectful distance. Tiana had never been so glad to see her father. She stood tall, clutching her backpack to her chest, wanting him to see that she was okay, that she had handled herself the way he taught her. When Chief Johnson reached his daughter, his first move wasn't what the crowd expected. No dramatic confrontation, no immediate shouting. Instead, he placed his hands gently on Tiana's shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Tiana nodded. "I'm fine, Dad, just shaken up." He searched her face for a moment longer, then pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. When he released her, his expression had changed. The worried father disappeared behind the stern face of the chief of police. "Which officers are involved?" he asked, though his eyes had already found Donovan and Wilson. Officer Wilson stepped forward immediately. "Sir, I'm Officer Wilson. This is Officer Donovan. There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Chief Johnson repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "My 16-year-old daughter was detained without cause, had her property searched without consent, and was threatened with arrest while sitting on a park bench. Is that what you call a misunderstanding?" Officer Donovan finally found his voice. "Sir, we had reports of suspicious activity in the area. I was following protocol." "Don't," Chief Johnson cut him off. "Do not stand there and lie to my face, Officer Donovan." He gestured toward the crowd. "At least 15 citizens recorded what happened here. I'll be reviewing every second of footage." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone called out, "We saw everything, Chief." Chief Johnson turned to address the gathering. "I appreciate everyone's concern. Thank you for looking out for my daughter. If anyone has video of this incident, please email it to the address on my card." He handed business cards to those closest to him, which were passed around. One of the other officers who had arrived with the chief approached Tiana. "Miss Johnson, would you like to give a statement about what happened?" Before she could answer, a woman pushed forward through the crowd. "I'd like to give a statement too. I saw the whole thing. That officer," she pointed at Donovan, "was completely out of line." "So would I," said the businessman who had spoken up earlier. "And us," added one of the teens who had been recording from the beginning. Chief Johnson nodded to the officer beside him. "Take statements from everyone willing to provide them." He turned back to face Donovan and Wilson. "You two will return to the station immediately. Turn in your badges and guns to Lieutenant Wright. You're both on administrative leave pending investigation." Officer Wilson nodded, his face grim but accepting. Officer Donovan started to protest. "Sir, with all due respect." "That's the last thing you have right now," Chief Johnson interrupted. "Respect would have been treating my daughter, treating any young person, with dignity. What you did wasn't policing, it was harassment." The gathered officers moved to escort Donovan and Wilson to their cars. The crowd began to disperse, many stopping to offer words of support to Tiana before they left. As the commotion settled, Chief Johnson turned back to his daughter. The stern police chief was gone again, replaced by a father whose worry lines were deeply etched around his eyes. "Let's get you home," he said softly. Tiana looked up at him. "What's going to happen to them?" Her father sighed, resting a hand on her shoulder as they walked toward his car. "That depends on the investigation, but things are going to change around here, Tiana. I promise you that." She nodded, suddenly feeling very tired. "I just wanted to sit on a bench, Dad. That's all." "I know, honey." His voice caught slightly. "And you should be able to. Every person in this city should be able to sit on a bench without fear." As they reached his car, Chief Johnson paused, looking back at the park where everything had happened. "This stops now," he said, more to himself than to Tiana. "Starting tonight." The police station buzzed with unusual tension the next morning. Officers spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at the closed door of the chief's office. Inside, Chief Johnson sat at his desk, reviewing video after video sent in by witnesses. Each clip showed the same scene from different angles, his daughter being harassed for simply sitting on a park bench. Tiana sat quietly in a chair across from him, watching her father's face darken as he studied the footage. She'd insisted on coming with him today. "If we're going to fix this," she had told him over breakfast, "then I need to be part of it." A knock on the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Wright entered, carrying a thick folder. "The witness statements, sir," she said, placing the folder on his desk. 27 in total. We've also pulled Officer Donovan's record." Chief Johnson nodded. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Please ask Donovan and Wilson to be ready in the conference room in 15 minutes. After the lieutenant left, China leaned forward. Dad, can I ask you something? Her father looked up from the folder. Of course. If I wasn't your daughter, if I was just some random black teen in the park, would anything happen to that officer? The question hung heavy in the air. Chief Johnson removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Honestly, probably not enough, he admitted. A complaint might be filed. There might be a note in his record. Maybe a short suspension. He tapped the videos playing on his computer. But most kids don't have 27 witnesses and multiple videos backing up their story. Tiana nodded slowly. That's what I thought. But, her father continued, that's exactly why we're here today. Because it shouldn't matter who your father is. This shouldn't happen to anyone. They made their way to the conference room where Officers Donovan and Wilson waited. Wilson stood when they entered, while Donovan remained seated, his arms crossed defensively. Chief Johnson placed a laptop on the table and played one of the videos. The room filled with the sounds of the confrontation, Tiana's clear voice stating her rights, Donovan's dismissive tone. When it ended, the chief spoke. Officer Wilson, would you say this video accurately represents what happened yesterday? Wilson nodded. Yes, sir, it does. Officer Donovan? Donovan shifted in his seat. Sir, that video doesn't show the context. The park has been a hot spot for drug activity. I was doing my job. Chief Johnson played another video, this one showing the wider park area. I see families, joggers, elderly couples, and teenagers enjoying a public space. What I don't see is any probable cause to detain my daughter. With all due respect, sir, Donovan said, I didn't know she was your daughter. The room went silent. Chana felt her father tense beside her. That, Chief Johnson said slowly, is exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone's parent is to treat them with basic dignity and respect. He opened the folder Lieutenant Wright had brought. Your record shows 7 complaints of excessive force and discriminatory behavior in the past 2 years alone. Donovan's face flushed. Those complaints were dismissed. They were dismissed, the chief corrected, because there wasn't enough evidence, no videos, no witnesses willing to come forward. He gestured to the laptop. This time is different. Wilson cleared his throat. Sir, I want to apologize to your daughter. I should have stepped in sooner. Tiana appreciated the apology but stayed quiet. This wasn't about her feelings now. This was about something bigger. Chief Johnson pulled out 2 documents. Officer Wilson, you'll be assigned to desk duty and required to complete additional training on intervention strategies and community policing. Wilson nodded, accepting the paper. Officer Donovan, I'm recommending termination. What? Donovan stood up abruptly. You can't do that over one incident. One incident that was caught on camera, the chief replied evenly. How many weren't? He slid the paper across the table. You have the right to appeal, of course. The hearing is scheduled for next week. Donovan's face twisted with anger. This is because she's your daughter. If she was anyone else. If she was anyone else, Chief Johnson cut in, his voice like steel, she might not have known her rights. She might have been too afraid to speak up. She might be sitting in a cell right now instead of standing here. He gestured toward the door. You're dismissed. As the officers left, Chana watched her father's shoulders sag slightly once the door closed. Do you think it will make a difference? She asked quietly. Her father looked at her, determination replacing the momentary wariness. It has to. Because next time, it might be someone who doesn't have a police chief for a father. News travels fast in a city. By the next day, Tana couldn't go online without seeing the videos of her confrontation with Officer Donovan. Local news channels played clips on repeat. Social media exploded with hashtags like #SittingWhileBlack and #ChiefsDaughter. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and classmates. You okay? Her best friend texted for the 5th time that morning. Tiana stared at her phone, unsure how to answer. Was she okay? The incident had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Donovan's angry face, felt the weight of everyone's stares. Yet beneath the anxiety was something else, determination. Working on it, she finally replied. Downstairs, voices drifted from the kitchen. Tiana recognized her father's deep tones alongside several others. She made her way down and found him sitting at the table with three community leaders she knew well: Mrs. Rivera from the neighborhood council, Pastor Thompson from the local church, and Mr. Washington, who ran the youth center where Tiana sometimes volunteered. They'd all looked up when she entered. "There she is," said Mrs. Rivera warmly. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" Tiana shrugged, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. "I've had better weeks." Her father gestured to an empty chair. "We were just discussing next steps. I thought you might want to join us." Tiana sat down surprised. Her father had always kept his police work separate from home life. "What kind of next steps?" she asked. Pastor Thompson leaned forward. "Your experience has opened a door, Tiana. People are paying attention right now in a way they haven't before. The question is, what do we do with that attention?" Mr. Washington nodded. "I've had kids at the center talking about this nonstop. Some of them have had similar experiences, but didn't know how to speak up or were afraid to. That's why we're here," Mrs. Rivera added. "Your father has proposed some changes to police training and procedures, but we think there's opportunity for more community involvement." Chief Johnson slid a document across the table to Tiana. "This is the draft of the new training program I'm implementing. I want your input." Tiana scanned the paper, her eyes widening. "You're making all officers go through bias training and community service hours?" Her father nodded. "And body cameras that can't be turned off during civilian interactions. Plus a civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints." "The department won't like that," Tiana observed. "Some won't," her father agreed. "Change is never comfortable, but it's necessary." Mr. Washington tapped the table thoughtfully. "We need to make sure these changes stick. That means getting the community involved in monitoring progress." "Exactly," said Mrs. Rivera. "And that's where you come in, Tiana." Tiana looked up, surprised. "Me? What can I do?" Pastor Thompson smiled gently. "Share your story. Help other young people understand their rights and how to safely assert them." "We're organizing a town hall meeting next week," her father explained. "The mayor will be there, along with community leaders and police representatives. I'd like you to speak." Tiana felt a flutter of anxiety. Public speaking for debate team was one thing. This was different. "I don't know." "You don't have to decide now," her father said quickly. "Just think about it." Mrs. Rivera reached across the table and squeezed Tiana's hand. "What happened to you was wrong. But sometimes wrong things can lead to right changes if we're brave enough to speak up." Later that evening, as Tiana sat on her bed scrolling through more news stories about the incident, she paused on an article featuring Officer Donovan's photo. The piece mentioned his hearing scheduled for the following week. He was fighting the termination recommendation, claiming he was being made a scapegoat. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Curious, she opened it. "Hey Tiana, this is Officer Wilson. I got your number from your father. I'm testifying at Donovan's hearing next week. I wanted you to know I'm telling the whole truth. What happened wasn't right. I should have done more to stop it. I'm sorry." Tiana read the message twice, surprised by the unexpected apology. Then she opened her laptop and began typing. If she was going to speak at the town hall, she needed to be ready. The title of her document, "More Than the Chief's Daughter: What Everyone Deserves from Those Sworn to Protect Them." The community center was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, squeezed into corners, and spilled out into the hallway. Camera crews from local news stations set up in the back, their lights creating bright spots in the crowded room. At the front, a long table held microphones for the panel. The mayor, Chief Johnson, Mrs. Rivera, Pastor Thompson, and Mr. Washington. And Tiana. She sat next to her father, fighting the urge to fidget with her note cards. The crowd's low murmur felt like ocean waves crashing in her ears. She spotted familiar faces, her debate team coach giving her an encouraging thumbs up, her best friend mouthing "You got this," the teens who had recorded the incident in the park nodding respectfully when they caught her eye. The mayor tapped his microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. What happened in our city last week has sparked an important conversation, one that's long overdue." Tiana half listened as the mayor spoke about community and police relations, about trust and accountability. Her attention was drawn to the back of the room, where Officer Wilson had just slipped in. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Beside him stood Lieutenant Wright and several other officers in uniform. And now, the mayor was saying, "I'd like to introduce someone whose experience has become a catalyst for change, Tiana Johnson." The room fell silent as Tiana approached the microphone. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She took a deep breath and unfolded her notes. "A week ago," she began, her voice surprisingly steady, "I was just a regular teenager sitting on a bench in the park." She told her story simply, without dramatic flourishes. The park bench, the officer's approach, the backpack, the fear, the anger. The crowd hung on her every word. "But my story isn't unique," she continued. "What makes it different is that my father is the chief of police. What makes it different is that people recorded what happened. What makes it different is that Officer Donovan picked the wrong girl to harass." She looked up from her notes, scanning the crowd. "But what about all the right girls and boys? The ones without a police chief for a father? The ones without 27 witnesses? The ones who don't know exactly what their rights are or are too scared to speak up?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. "I've been thinking a lot about power this past week. Officer Donovan thought he had power over me because of his badge. He didn't know my father had an even bigger badge. But that's not how this should work. Our rights don't depend on who our parents are." She glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "My dad always taught me that with power comes responsibility. The police have power. They carry guns. They can arrest people. They make decisions that change lives in an instant. That power comes with the responsibility to use it fairly, to protect everyone equally." Tiana set aside her notes. "I'm 16 years old. I shouldn't have to be standing here talking about police reform. I should be worrying about debate team and homework and what movie to see with my friends this weekend. But here we are." She gestured to the proposals on the table in front of her. "My father has drafted changes to police training and procedures, body cameras that stay on, regular bias training, a civilian review board with real power, community service requirements for all officers." Another deep breath. "These are good first steps, but they only matter if we hold the department accountable for following through. That's where all of you come in." Tiana looked directly at the news cameras. "I'm starting a youth program called Know Your Rights to teach young people how to safely interact with police. I've already got 15 volunteers from my school. Officer Wilson has agreed to help, along with other officers who want to be part of the solution." She spotted Wilson nodding in the back, a small smile on his face. "What happened to me was wrong, but something good can come from it if we work together." The room erupted in applause as Tiana returned to her seat. Her father squeezed her hand under the table, pride evident in his eyes. As the meeting continued, with community members asking questions and offering suggestions, Tiana felt something she hadn't expected: hope, not just for change in policies, but for change in hearts. 6 months later, Officer Donovan's termination was upheld after his appeal failed. Officer Wilson became the first instructor in the new community relations training program, and Tiana's Know Your Rights workshops expanded to 5 schools across the city. The incident in the park hadn't just changed Tiana's life. It had changed her community. All because a cop took a black teen girl's backpack, not knowing her father was the chief of police.